Welcome to the ITS seminar of the week. I'm Susan Handy, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm delighted to be introducing today's speaker, Stephanie Pincel, who comes to us from UCLA, where she's an adjunct professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Communities, which is a part of the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, a very interesting place from what we heard over lunch. So Stephanie has been working in this area for some time now. She has written extensively about land use in California, environmental justice, habitat conservation efforts, water and energy policy. She's had lots of funding from lots of important organizations like NSF and the California Energy Commission. Her book, Transforming California, The Political History of Land Use in the State, is the definitive work on land use, politics, and policies of California. And I haven't read it yet, so I think I need to read that. Yes. Her greatest claim to fame, of course, is that she is a UC Davis graduate, undergraduate and master's degree. Worked with Bob Johnston when he was on the faculty here. So please welcome Stephanie, and I will turn it over to her to hear about this fascinating project. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Susan, and it's really wonderful to be here and to be among collaborators as well. I want to recognize Mike McCoy, who's been absolutely central to all of the work that we've done, and Martha Krebs for her support behind the scenes has also been extremely important. The lesson is you can't do any work that's complex and multifaceted without collaborators, and so for all of you who want to be researchers in the future, finding good collaborators is really the key to individual success and to group success. So I'm deeply grateful for all of the support that we've gotten over the years from people who think that this project is important. I have to say that I feel slightly, I was telling Susan I feel slightly intimidated because I'm absolutely not a transportation planner. And in fact, I'm not really a person who works comfortably with data, to be really honest. I find data absolutely critical to understanding and to providing ways to understand what's going on in the state. And so by virtue of that, I came to believe that we needed to apply a much more thoughtful understanding of use of data to understanding urban systems. And so I'm going to run you through a little bit of the project that we've been working on. I'll emphasize a little bit of some of the transportation results because I think they're absolutely wonderful and very, very interesting, and hopefully it'll apply or illuminate some of the questions that you all have already been looking at yourselves. Let's see. Is that going to do it? Yeah. So first of all, an overview of this big research project. I have to say, I've told Mike this before, I feel like we were successful in getting funding and then I jumped off a building without a parachute, and we're just trying to make it all happen before we splat on the ground. And so feedback and questions are always welcome. We are it's a pilot project where we're establishing the urban metabolism, which I'll define in a little bit, of LA County. And we are funded by the Energy Commission Public Interest Energy Research Program of the Energy Commission, which was actually quite an extraordinary program that funded really interesting and innovative research. And I have to compliment the CEC for taking risks in some ways in some of the research that they funded, because it has, I think, brought some new understandings to the state. We start from a position where we look at cities as complex systems of flows, but they don't just occur. They're really directed by human decisions within institutional contexts such as planning. So planners develop zones, zoning codes and things that guide where things are located in cities, and that puts a certain sense of direction on how those flows work within cities, and administration. So the administration of these flows really are important to begin to understand, to see how these complex urban systems work. And we feel that urban metabolism is a way to describe the flows that sustain cities. We often forget, when we're talking about things like sustainability, we forget all of those inputs that are coming in and where they're going and the supply chain effects, and then the waste flows out. We truncate the analysis in ways that prevent us from really looking at the full extent of how our cities are sustained by these flows. And our research is a novel way of putting together different kinds of data and models to better describe what is going on in a complex urban system, and in our case, it's LA County. So we're looking at economic flows. We're looking at ground-up data, which is the first time in urban metabolism that's ever been included. We're looking at transportation analysis, and it's a big component of it. And we're also bringing in life cycle analysis in the transportation sector in particular, but also in building construction, to really better understand what is the embedded energy flow in the city already, because that will, and we talked about this over lunch, I think help guide future investments in urban areas. If you neglect to realize how much embedded energy already exists in the urban fabric, then there's more tendency to build on a green field, because you've neglected to take into consideration what's already there and rework what's already been extracted and transformed and embedded in that urban fabric. So places like this can be called zero net energy if you forget that there's concrete here, there's metal here, there's electricity and power that was used to create it. It's not, zero net energy is a kind of oxymoron when you're in a place like this, or in any city, as a matter of fact. And so beginning to really look at things a little bit more critically and in depth, we feel is a way to move towards greater sustainability, because we cannot continue to extract resources willy-nilly afresh over time for the long-term future. So we have project partners that I'd like to acknowledge, and Mike is prominent there. And we work with Mike Chester at Arizona State University, Paul Benji, who was one of my early collaborators, a very interesting group, Economic Roundtable, that does economic analysis. It's a nonprofit organization on impacts in LA. Zoe Elizabeth, my project manager, Giovanni Sarcella, whom probably many of you know here, and Dan Flaming, who's the president of the Economic Roundtable. So urban metabolism. Urban metabolism is a concept that was actually developed by engineers. The idea was, can we begin to account for the flows into cities and the waste flows out? And mostly, it was a response to, it was first developed in the 60s by an engineer named Woolman, who was concerned about the long-term sustainability of water, actually, in urban areas. So we began to quantify how much water was being used by cities. And then gradually, those kinds of approaches, the urban metabolism analysis, was expanded. And there have been urban metabolism analysis for about 30 or 40 cities throughout the world at this point. The one that we're doing in LA is trying to go deeper, as I said before, including the embedded energy and then emergent energy use that we need to begin to understand going forward. For example, energy impacts of alternative transportation modes and land use. So say in Los Angeles, we're very successful in building transportation-oriented developments. What are the new emergent patterns that are going to arise out of that that should be taken into consideration, and that themselves will create new path dependencies that will have all kinds of implications. So we want to be in a position to show how infrastructure design, including the life cycle of that infrastructure, can lead to emergent behaviors across a city and sets other path dependencies. So in LA, we have these gigantic block-size transportation-oriented developments. 1 and 2 bedrooms. Well, who's going to live there over time? Well, you don't have a constant, we don't think, a constant crop of young people to populate those buildings. But they will have taken up all this space, and the emergent behavior going forward has been neglected. It's a very short-term approach to increasing transportation use on the big corridors. I could talk more about that. It's one of my pet peeves today. So, and they're really ugly, which really bothers me. But so to date, the urban metabolism analyses of these various cities have been at a very high level. So LA uses so much water, so much electricity. Tokyo uses so much electricity, so much water, and so on. But you don't know anything that's going on inside those systems, by whom, to do what, and to produce what kinds of waste, where, and all of those things. And we feel that in order, like I said before, to really get what's going on, you have to dig a lot deeper. So we're trying to do the proof of concept that when you get more granular data, you can describe the system better, and then you can do the kinds of interventions that are necessary to curb what may appear to be excessive uses or change use patterns. But unless you know what's going on, it's really difficult to do that, and policies are developed that are very broad scale and no baselines are developed. And so you don't actually know how those policies are affecting the landscape in a fine kind of way. You don't know where it works, why it works, with whom it works or doesn't work. And so you can't revise and adapt to improve those interventions very well. And in doing that kind of granular analysis, then you can better take into account equity impacts. Right? You can begin to see across the landscape who's benefiting the most from certain kinds of interventions or not. Public health impacts, if you add the public health component. So it's ambitious, but it's a pilot project. We're just really hoping that it's going to spark an interest in doing this in many other places and advance the methodologies, quite frankly. So I forgot to put the granular data on here, but I'll talk about it more. Mike is here, so I feel a little embarrassed. We're using in-plan data with the PICUS model, and then Carnegie Mellon economic input-output life cycle analysis data adjusted for California. And if any of you have ever had an opportunity to explore the Carnegie Mellon EIO-LCA data, it is a treasure trove of information of the amount of energy used per $1 million of output, but also environmental impacts of that $1 million output. And it, unfortunately, is not very well updated, and that's why we're lucky to have the California data funded by the PEER program, by the way. And it's very eye-opening. And we're conducting life cycle cradle-to-grave analyses for certain infrastructures, and I'll show you one of the transportation results shortly. We're doing some of social and environmental health impacts, looking at criteria pollutants, for example, in different employment sectors and GHG emissions in employment sectors, as well as using granular data from the ground up, electricity, gas, and some water data, which I'll show you as well. Okay, so we have two aims, as you can probably begin to guess. One is theoretical, and that is to improve urban metabolism as an approach. People don't like it to be called a method for some reason. The gurus of urban metabolism say it's not a method. It's a description, I guess. But we're trying to add different ways of quantifying and better ways of quantifying flows to understand complex urban systems. And then practically, we have very practical desires out of this. We want to help or provide information that has previously not been available to policymakers and to agencies and to other actors like nonprofit organizations and ICLEI or other ones to enable them to target investments, as I said, in energy, water, and water efficiency and conservation, so that it's really, as I think it's Jaime Lerner says, doing urban acupuncture rather than this kind of less finely thought out sets of interventions for climate mitigation and adaptation and resilience. And of course, the background for all of this is really SB 375 and concerns about how do we make our cities produce less greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time, you would imagine there are ancillary benefits like reductions of criteria pollutants and other benefits. And then to ensure that these equity and health considerations of the different choices are better understood. So I'm going to try to present Mike Chester's analysis. His work, I think, is really, really interesting. And so we were able to get some money from the PEER project to apply life cycle analysis to several of the important transportation sectors of Los Angeles. So we're comparing, we decided we would compare different transportation modes using the life cycle analysis tool. Bus rapid transit, light rail, and the passenger vehicle. And he's now, and I'll show you the results of that, and then he's also applying life cycle analysis to look at the embedded energy in the county's roadways and parkades. And that has involved the most amazing set of quantifications. He has had a student measuring all of the streets in LA County with a ruler from the Thomas Brothers Guide. It's about that thick for LA County. And then what they've been doing is looking at county parcel assessor data to evaluate the age of the different neighborhoods, because in the parcel assessor data you have the age of the structure. So they can say, okay, this neighborhood was built in 1935, and the road has been repaved using models, right, of generally how often a road is repaved, at what depth, depending on the kind of road it is, and from that, estimate the embedded energy that has been spent already in the urban fabric. And I think this kind of twists your mind completely about what a city is made of and what's required to maintain what is in place. And of course, what we find is, not too surprisingly, that embedded infrastructure accounts for far more carbon than the vehicles that travel on those roads on a daily basis. And so when you're thinking about transportation investments, these kinds of ways of looking at infrastructure, I think, are extremely interesting and thought-provoking, and also help inform, weighing where you're going to put that CO2 investment into the future. I just love his work. And he's also looking at the same kind of embedded energy in different building types, built in different years. So we'll be able to account for the embedded energy in the actually constructed part of LA County. Of all the parking structures, parking places, there's a lot of embedded energy in parking, as we know. This was done for me. I don't know how to animate. I'm going to learn next. But so this is where the blue is actually called the gold line. It should have been gold. And the green is the orange bus rapid transit line, for those of you who have not been to Los Angeles. And so those are and they've been in operation about 10 years. So we wanted to get transportation modes that had been in service for some time, not anything new, so that we could be relatively certain of the passengers, of the boarding, the numbers of passengers on each one of them, so that the comparison between the transportation modes would have some legs, right? It's all done at existing ridership. So, as I said, these are Mike's slides. So, essentially, we're looking at the life cycle from cradle to grave. So, the extraction of the raw materials, the manufacturing, the operation of maintenance, and the end of life for each piece of this transportation infrastructure, and the vehicles for the rail cars, the buses, the single occupancy vehicle, the infrastructure of each one of those roadways that that each travels on. We even included in the infrastructure the irrigation of the vegetation along the bus rapid transit line, and then the fuel mix that, of course, makes all this work. So here are the system boundaries, and those of you who, probably a number of you know life cycle here, so I don't have to really belabor the point. But I think that these are extremely useful ways of thinking about day-to-day life, actually. We can go back to it if you have any questions, but I think I'll move on. So some of the environmental indicators that we chose were based on in the energy mix, the air emissions and the greenhouse gases. So criteria, pollutants, and their health effects, and then the greenhouse gases. And what we found is there's not one optimal solution. If you want to optimize criteria pollutants, you may not be optimizing greenhouse gas emissions reductions, right? If you want to reduce one or the other. And so there are no easy fixes or no easy solutions going forward. But overall, given existing ridership and still, bus rapid transit and light rail still both produce less criteria pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions than the single occupancy vehicle when the full life cycle is taken into account. So we think that this kind of heuristic example provides policymakers with an additional insight into why you might want to invest more in public transportation. So so Mike did an analysis in terms of greenhouse warming and global warming potential using all of these different pieces of the life cycle. And you can see that once DWP, Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles, goes off of coal, which they will in 2020, the mayor has just promised that, the gold line actually comes out looking pretty good in greenhouse gas emissions. And this is going to be published pretty soon, so then I'll be able to share it with you. And then for PM, the gold line still looks pretty good, and but you can see that all of the pieces of it are slightly different. So you have to look at the full life cycle, and at different pieces of the life cycle, you'll get different results. And then we looked at ozone precursors. And it's actually kind of exciting that the light rail comes out so well, but on the other hand, in LA, there's been a huge investment in bus rapid transit. So there's a policy question there and we haven't looked at how much it costs to deploy each one of these transportation alternatives. And clearly, bus rapid transit is the least expensive. But as a bus rapid transit rider, I can tell you it's not always the most practical for the passenger. So there's that. Until we have bus-only lanes, we're contending with traffic. So, but when you look at the SO2 emissions, the gold line doesn't look so good, particularly with the present 39% coal mix. If we have less coal, then it'll change. Yes? Sorry. Here? I don't know. Let's see. Energy production, wouldn't that be under in the green line, in the green part where LADWP uses 39% coal? Oh, okay. The color shifted? Yeah, the color. Okay. Oh, good point. So the urban metabolism implications, as I think I've said this before, requires that infrastructure not only has present costs but life cycle costs. That when you take that into account, the cradle-to-grave production of all of this system, you may get different kinds of results relative to greenhouse gas emissions or particulates or other criteria pollutants that will make a that could make a difference in the choice by the policymaker. And the other interesting point, I think, is that and the direction that we want to take this in is that transportation systems are often creators of path dependencies, and then those path dependencies create other path dependencies. So take, for example, in LA, where we've been widening the 405 freeway. $1 billion to widen this freeway. And that was as a result of a compromise with the proposition, the bond proposition to increase, it wasn't a bond proposition, pardon me, the increase in sales tax. So part of getting the increase in sales tax for transportation investments was that we would widen the 405 freeway. Well, when you widen a freeway, of course, you increase traffic on that freeway, and it's this kind of hugely, it's a huge transportation investment that creates more path dependency. You think you're going to move faster because the freeway has been widened, so you go back into your car thinking that it's going to be faster than taking, well, there's no public transportation that takes you over the that corridor, but you can see where that investment then creates more path dependencies in that direction that then create more demand to improve that transportation mode. And so path dependency is a self-reinforcing kind of phenomena that that transportation planners have pointed out, but that hasn't really, I don't think, sufficiently been understood by the policy community. And the policy community, of course, is subject to what they think the public is going to want. And so people are used to doing things in one way. And so to suggest that you could do something different will require them to change their habits. And that is really difficult and challenging for people. And so you tend to reinforce that same path because it's what people know, right? There are so mthat examples of that. And it's what creates a difficulty in change because people know that one way of doing things. And then we point out that true costs are really rarely evaluated, and that this kind of analysis can begin revealing those. So the next steps will be, as I explained, the embedded energy in all of the roadways and the parkades, and looking at land use and transportation alternatives, including mapping out what could be future transit-oriented design sites in the county by looking at where Metro is going to have new stations and seeing what kind of land use there is around that, what the potential for building on those sites might be, and then looking at the embedded energy costs and the different kinds of densities and construction that could be proposed there, and what the effect on the neighborhoods would be. And that's enormously important because will it entrain more gentrification? Will it defeat the purpose of getting the people who need the most transportation, access to public transportation, by changing the characteristic of the neighborhood, and they won't be able to afford it anymore? All of these things we feel are within this and this more deep analysis, looking at the whole life cycle of these new developments. So I'm going to switch to a topic that I feel slightly more comfortable presenting because it's my own work, and that is really our emphasis at UCLA, and it's mapping energy and gas and some water use from the bottom up. I was saying at lunch that what's absolutely remarkable today is that no baselines of energy use have been established anywhere in the state. We actually do not know across a geographical space energy use in a granular way over time. And the state has spent, I learned recently, $13 billion on energy conservation and efficiency programs, and there are really no before and after studies using real data. I went to a presentation of the Southern California Edison Company, where they're doing some similar mapping, and they are the ones who administer a lot of the appliance efficiency programs, where you get a discount for a more efficient refrigerator, dishwasher, or washing machine. And the way they've calculated energy savings is a modeled energy conservation, a projected conservation of energy. They don't actually have the data that show that that customer's electricity use has been reduced. They don't know. And so it's a kind of remarkable gap in knowledge, because if you were able to track the success or not, then you could understand, are there behavioral issues, are there income issues, is there a rebound effect, what's going on in the cases that don't work, so that you can refine your program. To my knowledge, and I could be mistaken about this, but I don't think that anybody has actually been doing that kind of work. So we're hoping that this exercise will loosen the thinking about how you evaluate energy conservation programs, and lots of other things. So we're doing electricity, water, and gas. We're looking at solid waste flows as well, and that's a whole other world of mystery. And we're looking at these flows, looking at sociodemographic characteristics using the census, so income, ethnicity, education, those kinds of things. County parcel assessor data that include the land use type, so commercial, industrial, residential, age of building, size of building, shell of building, as I mentioned before, and of course climate zones. So we were able to get data directly from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. It's a municipally owned utility, and it represents a lot of customers. So we're pretty happy about that. There are 4 million people who live in LA, about 400,000 households, and of course many more billing level addresses than that. We were able to get them by customer class, so commercial, industrial, residential, by billing address, and by billing cycle 2005 to 2011. We were also finally able to get data from the Southern California Edison data and gas company data, but only by getting a non-disclosure agreement with the Public Utilities Commission. So I think for those of us who are interested in this kind of work, the data accessibility is really serious analytics. And I can talk to you more about that afterward. So what we've done, let's see. This is work that we've done. Mike McCoy and Giovanni Cersella did really the first initial pioneering cut on this, using our first round of data from DWP, which is at the ZIP +4 level. And then subsequently, we were able to get the actual billing address level data. And what you see here, I should have done the animation, but what we've done is created these maps where you can see by census block group, because you have to aggregate it for customer privacy, how much energy is used throughout the year by month by these different places in Los Angeles. And it's working with DWP. DWP is now very interested in the data behind this and an analysis that's much more finely grained for their internal uses. But we've produced public maps, so you can go on our website and you can look at the changes in energy use over time. You can put in your address, and it'll give you the census block group that you are part of. It'll give you the average income of that census block group, the average size of the building of that census block group, and the energy use in that census block group. And then we've created these pie charts that show the distribution of land use within the different census block groups. So some of them are entirely residential, and some of them are mixed use, and some of them are highly, highly, highly aggregated if it tends to be more of an industrial area, because you don't want to reveal the electricity use of one user, because that would violate customer privacy. But it begins to tell you a little bit about what's going on where in the urban fabric, and makes the customers more aware of what's going on, but also, I think, will allow interventions over the long term. LADWP is very interested in this work, looking forward because of climate impacts, and parts of LA are going to become much warmer. So what is the existing pattern of electricity use? Who lives there? What's the building type? What are the kinds of things that should be done to ensure that people don't suffer from high heat events? They're potentially interested in investing in distributed generation in places where there are energy peaks as well, so that you can relieve the pressure on the grid. They are extremely interested in restructuring their rates so that the lifeline low-income populations are well protected, but that the tiers get stricter over higher energy users. And we're beginning to do some economic analysis around that. They're also interested in messaging, targeting messages to different ethnic communities as the patterns, if there are patterns that are important in terms of different energy use. And then also just understanding energy use by different economic sectors. So we're going to go back and do some analysis according to NAICS sector, the industrial sectors. So this has been a huge breakthrough, actually, because for a couple of reasons. One is trust is very hard to build between just about anybody, actually, but university researchers and public agencies are not natural allies, unfortunately. Agencies tend to go to consultants that they've worked with for a very long time, and the university is a kind of obscure, pin-headed place where it's kind of hard to figure out the right vocabulary and so on. And so I feel we're very happy that we've been able to build this relationship. And also, I think that it shows that the Department of Water and Power's mentality has evolved over time, and so that they're much more interested in really changing the way they do business, and that's quite significant. We have not had such good luck with privately owned utilities. So the water analysis is actually quite similar. I've been working for several years with Terry Hoag, who's now at the Colorado School of Mines, and Diane Pataki, Terry Hoag is a hydrologist. Diane Pataki is an ecologist. And the question has been, how much water is used outdoors in LA City? And from LADWP's perspective, it's anywhere from 40 to 60%. That's a big range. And they can't tell you very much more than that. And yet, conserving water in outdoor irrigation is really the next frontier for water conservation in Southern California, and probably up here too. I mean, Sacramento just got meters, but they're not dual meters, so you still don't know how much is used indoors and outdoors. Fresno and the rest of the valley won't be metered until 2020. And so what we're trying to do is use a novel way of assessing how much water is used indoors and outdoors by looking at the density of greenness from satellite imagery, but also measuring water use by vegetation and coupling that to really be able to look at the landscaping and predict how much water is being used out of doors. Most models, the most prevalently used model is one by the Pacific Institute, where it's basically the difference between winter water use and summer water use. And then they impute the difference to outdoor irrigation. It's probably a lot more complex than that, particularly because it gets hot sometimes in January in LA. You can have a heat wave and so on. So we are hoping that this is going to actually improve our understanding of water use. And so we have 10 years of data from LADWP at the billing level address. And look, this is the single family analysis. And if any of you know LA, you can see that this 10-year aggregate snapshot really tracks with wealth. Electricity also happens to track very well with wealth, too. And so I think it offers a lot of interesting challenges for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power in rethinking the rate structure because, well, wealthy people tend to be able to lobby more. It's going to be very complicated for them, but at least we'll be able to give them really good data about who's using how much water where and some of the characteristics of those populations, and hopefully do some econometric analysis that will help them better redo their tiered rates. And they're very complicated, actually. So we're doing that. For the rest of the county, it will be virtually impossible to do this except for some of the other municipally owned utilities like Burbank, Glendale, Long Beach, because there are literally hundreds of water purveyors in the county. And most of them, many of them are private, some of them are public. And so to get that kind of granular data from all of those is beyond the scope of certainly this research. But my aim is that all of the utilities, water, power, water, electricity, and gas, ultimately have to report usage data to public entities so that analysis can be done and understanding can be developed. What we'd like to do is, with this analysis, project how much water could actually be conserved without harming major vegetation. So what we've done is we've looked at drought periods where water restrictions have been put in place and very successfully, and looked at the difference in the greenness in the vegetation compared to regular rainfall periods, and have found that actually the vegetation doesn't suffer. Individual plots of grass may suffer, but the trees, for example, have not suffered. Whether that'll be true over time is another question, and that's why having the collaboration of an ecologist is very important. How much can water be reduced in outdoor irrigation in Los Angeles without harming tree canopy, for example? That's a really big question, completely unknown. So waste flows I'll just touch on briefly because I'm probably running out of time and people are getting a little tired. Statewide jurisdictions only report a single value to the state. So the city of Davis generates X amount of waste. Fine. Who's generating it? Where? How much of it is commercial? How much of it is industrial? We don't really, it's very, very difficult to know. In Los Angeles, we have commercial and residential. Commercial includes large multifamily properties. They're all lumped together. And so the reporting, even for commercial and residential, you can't tell exactly how much of the commercial is residential, like a big apartments, and on the residential side, you get much more, get much better reporting. But the real volumes are pretty much unknown from either commercial or residential sectors. And so again, here's this enormous, waste flows are huge, right? LA City has the highest diversion rate of any city of its size in the United States. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that it no longer goes to landfills because we're running out of landfills as much, but there's a huge volume of recyclables that go somewhere that have some value that is completely unknown. We know about the green waste, we know about the residual waste that goes to the landfills, but we really don't know about this other huge flow. And it's not about reducing the flow, it's about managing the flow. So here you have another black box across the landscape that's part of the urban metabolism, all the wastes that get produced. And we can't evaluate how much energy is in that, how much it could actually be brought back into production locally, because it's largely unregulated, except for trying to divert it away from landfills. And so I won't narrate these to you exactly, but you can see that even just the institutional architecture is very complex. And this is LA County. We have a paper that's going to be under review on this that I'd be happy to circulate to people once we've submitted it. But we're really trying to draw attention to this aspect of the urban metabolism that trash is no longer a very sexy issue, but it's still pretty big one. And then here's the city of LA. The city of LA is undergoing a new process of who's going to get to collect the trash. That'll simplify this a bit. But there's no new requirements for reporting. So in conclusion, urban metabolism is really an urban metabolism is the result of complex urban systems that are accretionary, right? You add things to it, at the edges, inside. It just builds on itself. They're largely opportunistic. So where is there cheap land? Where is it easy to do things? Where can we change something without having to redo everything? They're extremely political, obviously. They're obdurate. They're hard to change at the same time. It's like the 405 freeway. It's just shut it down. Air pollution was great, the reduction when we shut down the 405. There wasn't a catastrophe. The LA didn't fall into the ocean. But the idea of doing that on a permanent basis would be something else. The systems are interdependent and create these path dependencies. And we cannot forget that despite our concern about GHG emissions, all of these systems that we take for granted today are really a byproduct of our discovery of fossil fuels and our use and harnessing of fossil fuels. That has been, just look in this room, right? How much of it is fossil fuel based? A lot, right? And it's like we're blind to it because it's so ingrained in everything that we do all the time. The tabletop, the chairs, the rug, probably in the paints, the window coverings. It's absolutely staggering. And so when we think really about a low-carbon future or sustainable cities, unless we take into account this embedded fossil fuel in everything we touch, we're not actually going to get there. So our research is preliminary. It's difficult and complex. I have to write a summary paper in the next couple months, and I'm just agonizing over even thinking about it. We're experimenting by putting in both modeled data and actual granular data at different scales. So the trash data is at a completely different scale than anything else. How do you meld all that together in any kind of meaningful way? And of course, transportation is a key component and driver, and the keen interest by the state, given greenhouse gas emissions, makes it all that more relevant. But we see it, at least I see it, as both an artifact of the system and a driver of patterns. And so I'm trying to put it in its place within urban metabolism and see how all these systems work together. So I think that's it. Thank you very, very much for your patience, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I think we will have quite a bit of time for questions. I'm told that with the new microphone system, you should come up at least to the mid part of the room when you want to ask a question. So hopefully that does not intimidate all of you.
Yeah.
What are you going to write for your paper? So what part of this do you think you can break off and then get ready for a paper in 3 months? So I guess I'm trying to get at it. How far are you and what's the most feasible way to look at
Right. So I think that what I would like to do is develop the methodology paper and then have each of the participating researchers write a little example of some of the outcomes that they have found from the different methods, and then at the end of the paper do a synthesis. Kind of what I'm thinking about. Yeah. Yeah. I think that what would be really fun to produce with this is an atlas. And there are a few really, really interesting atlases out there using maps. And that would be a very, not only doable, but also you could do a lot with a map atlas explaining flows. Product, but that's a little bit down the line. Okay. All right. You were okay. So that was the question was about how I'm imagining writing this first paper. Yes. Hi.
Table and then you go back to the forest and then the forest with the machines cut
No
down.
forest on this table. Yeah. All right.
So how in your analysis how you track it?
The boundary question.
Right.
Yeah. Well, in the for the transportation boundaries, I showed you the slide. Did you see? You were not here. Okay. So the transportation analysis, I could show you the slide after the talk if you'd like. It's a very good question because it's somewhat subjective, actually, in where you choose to define the boundary. And it also depends on how much data you can get. Right? So it's opportunistic in that sense. And we're using exemplars. There's just a few pieces of this urban metabolism where we're going to do the life cycle analysis. So the buildings in LA County, transportation, infrastructure, roads, and is that it, Mike? Buildings, and I think that's it. Commodity flows, right. Carnegie Mellon economic very good question. So the Public Utilities Commission has promulgated guidelines to protect customer privacy, which are called the 1515 guidelines. So if you're looking at a geographical location with less than 15 customers, or a customer that uses more than 15% of the energy, you have to aggregate up beyond that group. Right? So hence we've been aggregating up to census block groups. I think that what we can do with the data is establish a rudimentary set of energy use baselines. That can be done. And the identification of patterns over the landscape that we can then correlate with county parcel assessor data about the kinds of land uses, the buildings, and so on, and general census data. The problem will be that we will not be in a position to do energy conservation program evaluation because we will not have either the information about what customers actually used the incentives and or where they lived. And even if we knew where they lived, we could not publish that. My hope is that this kind of analysis this kind of data made accessible, even at the 1515 level, will allow people with more imagination than me to begin to ask other kinds of questions. So, for example, a colleague of mine at UCLA, an economist, got some utility data, all confidential and hush-hush, about which utility. But they were able to look at the age of commercial buildings and electricity use. And it's all, in very vague terms, in terms of which ones and where. But what they found is that the newer buildings tend to use more energy than the older buildings. Right? Why is that? Well, they're hypothesizing a number of things. One is that the newer buildings, the people in the buildings know that they have more efficient heating and air conditioning systems. And so they will cool more because the HVAC system is more efficient. So you get a rebound effect. There's also something about the automation of those systems such that you don't need building managers. And in the older buildings, there are building managers who check the amount of energy that's being used and if the systems are working efficiently and so on. And so that makes the use of what they are expending much more efficiently done and much more regulated. And so there are unknowns now that we can't discover without this kind of data. And I think that we can begin to answer those questions, but we may need to go farther in terms of being able to analyze the data for the utilities in this much more granular way. The utilities aren't actually that interested in this. I learned, for example, from the former Public Works Director of the City of Santa Monica that many cities that are not Los Angeles, lease their street lights from Edison. And they pay Edison the electricity costs of running those street lights, right? Well, Edison hasn't invested in any LED street lighting improvements. Why would they, right? Because it'll reduce the energy costs for the cities, and it costs a lot of money to do it. They aren't going to have the same revenue. It's a lot of work, and so on. And so there's all of these complexities that arise when you begin to see who owns the grid and who owns the distribution of the electricity and who pays and who has the data. And anyway, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. So I'd be open to any ideas and suggestions.
I mean, part of what was on my mind as public interest energy research program shifts to the new EPIC, forget what the acronym is, it is much more directly tied to the interests of the investor-owned utilities.
Yes.
And so the extent to which what you want to do is of interest to them
Right.
becomes much more influential.
Absolutely.
And that's why being able to work with the LIDWP information or the SMUD information will likely not be of interest to those utilities. And yet it is of
Public
incredible
interest.
value to actually doing the research.
It's going to have to be a policy decision. Yep.
The IOUs to release data. PUC has been more on the utility side. But it's very buildings, I personally have experience when we were at Severson, we can open the windows. And at this time of the year, you don't need the air conditioning and all those things. Just open the windows. But with all the new buildings, you cannot open windows. And it's actually you don't need to turn on, it's automatically unless you do. So some of the older buildings could stay active.
Yeah.
Temporary requirement like LA.
Incredible what you've put together in terms of the data.
Right.
I mean, just that itself is an amazing accomplishment. A couple of times you mentioned using it as a I wanted to hear a little more about that. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of this information you've assembled could go into some of the kind of modeling that Mike Spruce has done in terms of, here's a scenario for this region,
Right.
the kind of development patterns we want to have, and the transportation investments we'll make. Let's look at total energy for this scenario versus that scenario. Is there some sense about using it in that kind of a way? Maybe that's too far down the road.
You know, if I could find the money to do it, it would be very interesting to do. Absolutely. So I think this is really just the beginning of a lot of potential use of this data. And at this point, our goal is really a descriptive goal at this point, and also to try to tease out some of the policy drivers if we can. Some of the legislative requirements, some of the rules, some of the inherent subsidies. I'm working very closely with a researcher named Juan Matute, and he's looking at the subsidies that contribute to greater fossil fuel use. So things like parking requirements, obviously, things like mortgage deduction, but also things like levels of service on roads. And I think over time we'll be able to piece out parts of it to really understand the policy context that leads to this kind of land use. There's 10 years of work here. So at this point, we're really just trying to get our deliverables out there, and write some articles on it. But I would welcome people's interest for sure, because there's so much that we can do with it. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes.
So I've gotten into, I may want to help a little bit on a piece of the original testing on 1515
Yeah.
aggregation method.
Right.
And with regards to that, you said you're doing most of the stuff now at a block group level. Is that being done as a simple aggregation of data through the block group, or is very active testing of the 1515 rules being applied to those that are having service provided within each block group? And if it fails at 15 to 15 rule, how is that being dealt with in the data preparation?
That's a very good question. We tested the census block group in the city of LA for the data aggregation to the census block. We tested the 1515 rule in the city of LA to see if we aggregated it up to the census block group, if it would be okay. And Jackie Murdoch, who did the work, found that worked if we had the pie chart of the distribution of energy use among the different land uses. Now, hopefully, we haven't made any mistakes. But for LIDWP, so far, it's been okay. I think for the county, it'll be much more difficult. Because in the county of LA, there are cities that are only industrial. And in those cities, there are very, very few industries. And so then it adds a whole level of aggregation that then may make the level of aggregation, make the analysis almost useless. And that's an issue. Yeah, and I think that in that case, they just have to be left blank rather than distorted. So there are lots of challenges with doing this kind of work due to the privacy issues. The privacy issues, in my mind, are somewhat overblown. And it's been blurred today with smart meters. And the PUC is requiring the deployment of smart meters at a very aggressive level without really, I think, knowing what difference the smart meter is actually going to make in customer behavior. I heard the other day that they estimate that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Martha, if you know this, they estimate that they will probably conserve 1% of energy with smart meters. But they have no idea if it's 1%. Since 1% really isn't very much, it's not a risk. What we're trying to say is, just wait a second. Let's kind of get a grip on what's actually going on so that when you spend all this kind of money, because it's really a lot of money, you're assured of some kind of outcome. And the only way you can do that is to have at least some better understanding of the energy system. And this, anyway, I could give you a speech about it, but yeah. Right. Oh, no, it's not. I'm not working on smart meters. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe I was confusing. I'm saying that the utilities have been asked to deploy smart meters. to that, and the assumption is it will affect customer behavior. That's a different set of research questions than my question. My question is really much more at a policy level and not individual behavior. Actual individual behavior, I'm interested in more as a customer class than you or you or you. So I think that a lot can be achieved by customer class, by public policy, like tiers, pricing tiers and things like that. And that individual behavior can also be affected by smart meters and stuff, but it's a whole other level of education and activity that we're not prepared to address. Does that answer your question? Oh, wait. And then... How do researchers get access to this information? Essentially the question, right? Well, I'm on a campaign to require the utilities to report their information to an energy data center that's not managed by the utilities. And that energy data center, which by all logic should be at the CEC, actually, but short of that, at UC, would be a place where all of the IOUs, the independently owned utilities, and hopefully the MOUs, would have to send their data by customer class, by billing cycle, and then at the Energy Data Center, proposals would be vetted for their scientific blah 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 and the public interest and so on. Data would be aggregated such that it wouldn't reveal a customer's information, but it could be analyzed statistically, much like the census data centers do. That's the model that I think we should push for. And short of that, we will not get anything useful over time. The utilities are proposing a common application form among all of the IOUs that a researcher would fill out, and each IOU would decide whether you were legitimate and if they wanted to give you their data. And so you'd have to go utility to utility to utility, and they would vet your proposal. That's what they're proposing. So it's, a lot of this kind of stuff is really about politics and persistence. So if you're interested, give me your name. I will add you to the list. I will call on you to write letters at the right time. I mean, honestly, the only way we're going to do this is by showing, by really participating in the process. Timely moment to be interested in this question. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. That's why I said, I think the utilities are between a rock and a hard place, and that their business model is antiquated, and they are struggling to meet conservation and efficiency standards, renewable portfolios. I mean, I think they are really stuck. And they're caught between their shareholders and the ratepayers and the PUC. They're providing their publicly regulated monopolies. We can't forget that they're publicly regulated monopolies. And so they have lots of bosses. Actually, I'm very sympathetic with their position, their structural position. The problem is they do not seem to be able, for whatever internal reasons, to have a different business model altogether. And so I think that there's a lot of issues. They're kind of dinosaurs in the 21st century. And so we're just pushing them over the cliff, in a sense, because they're losing more and more control. But the problem is really a structural one. They're not, they're no longer, the model doesn't work for everything that they need to do today. Water. Well, okay, well, just to give you a little bit of historical perspective, think about the early 20th century and what cities were like then. They were really, really, really bad, right? Cholera, diphtheria, polio, waste. I mean, they were very insalubrious. Working conditions were really bad. People were dying. There was a political movement called the Progressive Movement that brought in not only new government management systems, new technologies, but also better wages and everything else. So I don't think these situations, these conditions change by themselves. And so for some industries, there will be incentives because they will save money because they'll use less energy and it'll be profitable. For others, the profit model itself is predicated on waste. Sorry. You know, there are winners and losers in these things. And there's, you know, so I think it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be a real struggle. I think that the IOUs are facing a very, very difficult time. And I actually talked to somebody in the governor's office and suggested that the governor hold an IOU Energy Summit and really begin to pose the question about what these IOUs are going to look like in the 21st century. And I think that there's a crisis ahead of us. And there are different ways of dealing with it. There's proactive thinking it through and trying to develop a new business model, or there's just resistance. Both happen, and some, you know, we'll see what happens. But resistance is very common with the automobile companies. I mean, they almost went extinct, right? Saved them. Should we have saved them? I don't know. But so I think that change is very, very difficult, and to arrive at a different future than we have today, they have to do business differently. They can't, you know, what is it, Einstein's, you know, little ditty about how you make changes not by doing things the way you used to do it. So I think you know, part of this work is really to reveal the foundations of how our economies are built on fossil energy, and the change away from that is going to be hard. And the institutions that have created this incredible lifestyle are faced with enormous difficulties because we can't continue to do this. I'm not a meliorist in this. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What do you